When we try and make some sort of competitive game out of Pokemon, the concept of the standard metagame banning the most powerful Pokemon is obvious. Allowing Mewtwo, Arceus, and the like would warp the game around them excessively. If you want that, you can play Ubers, but the default singles metagame should be more balanced. The thing is, there are many other Pokemon who are not that strong, but still affect the game negatively. Should it only be the Groudons and Kyogres that are banned? For generations, the answer to that has been no, but with many controversial results from the votes that are taken on suspects, even regarding Pokemon we wind up looking back on as extremely overpowered, and not just bans either, but as unbans can be controversial, though these are rare. Today we're diving into every controversial tiering result since the practice began, and we'll start with this huge one with Dynamax. It is absolutely crazy to ban an entire generational mechanic. Generally, everything is done to avoid this, to only ban the most egregious examples so that you can maintain the mechanic to some degree. This had varying results. One could argue that preserving Gen 5 weather, for example, was more an aesthetic decision than a competitive one, and then you get into arguments over what was more important, and so on. But most players agreed that they would want to play with what Game Freak intended, even if what they intended was, shall we say, maybe not the most competitively sound. Dynamax, though, was so obscene that there was no salvaging the mechanic. It was just too complete in that it not only broke almost everything imaginable, it broke them to astronomical heights. Something as standard and almost innocuous as Dragon Dance Gyarados suddenly became utterly insane with ludicrous bulk, max airstream, and other such monstrosities flying around. Sure, you could simply preserve your own Dynamax to use it defensively, kind of how some players deal with terastallization in Gen 9, but ultimately, the sheer breadth of excessive power led to Dynamax ban. This was of course met with a great deal of outrage, especially since it was done so early in the generation, but Dynamax was so ridiculous, it was eventually banned even from Ubers. And on that subject, and with the mention of Tera, we have Tera Blast. Tera Blast itself is not quite the generational mechanic, but it comes very close. Tera itself, with the high impact of its on-a-dime type shifting, was of course immensely controversial from day one, and actually came very, very close to being banned itself. But the back-to-back banning of the generational mechanics was not to be. Despite consistent insistence from the player base afterwards, it was never to be revisited. After many years though, the other option was finally explored. Tera Blast, which, while not everything players disliked about Tera, sure represented a particularly bad side of it, arguably the worst. The fact that it gave everything an amazing coverage move, like a much better hidden power that you also had stab on and could be either physical or special, making it far too easy for just about anything to dunk on its counters, no matter what they were. It was especially brutal on already great Pokemon like Dragonite and Kyurem, which were already great Tera users, but Tera Blast debatably pushed them over the edge the way it allowed them to pick and choose their already limited answers, letting them really run away with games to alarming degrees. Still, the fact that this was such an iconic part of Gen 9 meant that this got a lot of players upset, especially since, in a sort of inverse of the Dynamax situation, Tera Blast had been around for so long. Now, speaking of the terrors of Gen 9 Kyurem, we have Kyurem not being banned in Gen 9. But first, if you've seen Goonbug going absolutely viral on TikTok lately, you know exactly why we need to talk about our sponsor, Clash of Critters. Yes, you can actually use that legendary meme to fight off the Zobo Horde invasion. Clash of Critters is a creature collector tower defense game where you collect cute little monsters called Tatari to defend yourself from a horde of less cute monsters called Zobos. Each Tatari has an element, so you better learn your type advantages. I especially love the art style of Clash of Critters because they double down on cuteness and keep it as a drawn art style over 3D models. And as you know, with anything we do around here, we find what's OP, and I think Goonbug is OP because it really abuses the taunt and stall mechanic in the game, as well as drop it that has a slow effect. In fact, the slow is so good that I even use it in a type disadvantage just for the effect. This allows you to clear Zobo Horde invasions much more efficiently, and if you're a shiny hunter like me, you'll be happy to know they have shiny variants too. I actually got a gorgeous shiny Frugling after just 4 hours of gameplay, which was amazing. Give it a try. Click the link in the description below to download the game and play to unlock exclusive reward packs featuring 1,000 pinballs, the rare Tatari, Frugling, and Crazy Nook. And thank you so much to Clash of Critters for sponsoring this video. Here's a real doozy. After getting banned in Gen 8 to no particularly egregious dissent, Kyurem was back on the chopping block in Gen 9. Twice, in fact. In its first suspect test, it narrowly missed the necessary ban percentage, reaching 58% pro-ban votes out of a required 60%. But it so continued to dominate the metagame with seemingly endless new sets that it received the second test. Here it was banned, but that wasn't the controversial part, at least not to a particularly egregious degree, and definitely not compared to the real controversy, which was why Kyurem wound up not actually being banned. Some players wanted Kyurem banned so badly and so distrusted the rest of the player base that they were willing to cheat to see it gone. They would achieve voting requirements on the ladder on various accounts and then give those accounts to other players that would vote to ban, which was extremely illegal. The real kicker to this controversy, though, unprecedented even by suspect testing's highly dramatic norms, was the fact that the number of illegitimate votes was enough to swing the result. Kyurem originally received 84 ban votes as opposed to 52 do not ban votes for a 61.8% result in favor of the ban side, but 11 illegitimate votes were nullified, resulting in a 74 to 51 ban versus do not ban vote. One of the illegitimate accounts had actually voted no ban, funnily enough. This meant the pro ban side had only received 59.2% of the votes, meaning no ban for Kyurem by less than a percentage. Now, this wasn't the only time a form of Kyurem had controversy around it. Early Black and White 2 was arguably the most despised a current generation metagame has ever been by its player base. It was almost universally loathed, and for good reason. There was already the general chaos of figuring out a metagame that had received many monsters that, if not broken, sure approached the territory unloaded on it, and was also loaded with broken threats that would later be banned. Genesect, Tornadus, Deoxys Defense, Landorus Incarnate. In this early stage, at least Sandvale was banned, but it also meant Garchomp returned, adding another not broken but incredibly dangerous Pokemon. So what was next in dealing with this metagame? Should we maybe suspect test one of these almost certain Ubers? Nope. How about we drop down a box art legendary? Of course, Kyurem Black, with its many easily exploitable defensive flaws, wasn't broken, not in the insanely high-octane metagame of that time, where almost everything has an extremely fast-paced offense team, nor was it broken in the post-ban metagame to follow. It was just another destruction machine, but that wasn't the point. It added nothing but another monster that couldn't be walled. It didn't check anything in any new ways, it just added more dragon power. Now let's go back to the first ban that set all these controversies in motion, which was also a dragon type, but in Gen 4, with Garchomp being banned in Diamond and Pearl. This was the original sin. In Gen 3, when online simulated Pokemon was smaller, tiering was largely intuitive, decided by the top players of respective communities. For instance, some had Celebi banned for a time, but the Gen 4 games' new Wi-Fi battling meant it was easier to battle people everywhere, and this brought in an explosion of new players, which led to the introduction of the democratic tiering process, which is still used today, 2 decades later. You could have a say in the game if you proved yourself capable. Garchomp was the first widespread representative of that tiering process, and when it got banned, man, were people mad. Garchomp was one of the poster Pokemon for Gen 4. It was the pseudo-legendary and champion Cynthia's ace Pokemon, most responsible for how easily she tended to wipe you out. Then you cross over to the competitive scene, and Garchomp is one of the best Pokemon around, the perfect combination of speed, attack, and dual stab, and on top of this, Sandvale made it absurd. Garchomp already crushed everything without the prospect of dodging ice beams, many of which it already devoured easily with its trusty Yachtberry. Wasn't it great to have that in-game favorite be so dominant competitively? Yes, but was it too much? Also yes, and all the Cresselia spam in the world couldn't hold it back. In retrospect, it's an incredibly obvious Uber, but at the time, this new process ridding players of such a favorite wasn't taken too kindly. Even beyond those who were fond of its design, there were also those who hated the idea of losing this weapon that allowed them to destroy everything. There's never a shortage of those either. Now for another in the Gen 4 Dragon Age, we have Latias. Before Gen 7, back when Soldew was a built-in calm mind for the Lati twins, they were among the best Pokemon in Ubers and about the last things you would want to test in Standard. Without Soldew though, the idea was a lot more palatable. Maybe not in Gen 3, but after the release of Platinum in Gen 4, Latias was unleashed. This was regarded by many to be a mistake. Gen 4 already had no shortage of powerhouses, and adding Lati to the mix seemed to exacerbate the issue. It was much faster than the recently banned Garchomp, leaving even the Chomp outspeeding Infernape in the dust with its Gengar equivalent base 110 speed. But unlike Gengar, it had superb bulk and the best, most defining stab of the era in Draco Meteor. Eventually, the metagame adjusted to it. After all, it had an extremely exploitable pursuit weakness, which led to some mixed feelings on the eventual discovery of the brokenness of the combination of Spikes and Choice Specs Draco Meteor, resulting in Latias returning to Ubers. This wasn't protested much, but over time in the post-Gen 4 meta, players began to wonder if Latias had really been that bad to deal with. For years, there was talk of reintroducing it, and eventually, it returned, though this was also controversial, arguably even more than its original introduction. It was no longer about Specs Draco so much as Latias being extraordinary defensively, which was actually a big reason it was being brought back, that it was able to take on many tough-to-handle threats like Zapdos and Breloom, but the concern was that Latias was too good at this, too difficult to break through, as a bulky Reflect Thunderwave set popped up that could deal with most variants of Tyranitar and was quite limited in answers. The idea that Latias' reintroduction was a mistake persisted for some years. Now to conclude the Gen 4 Dragon Triumvirate, we go to Salamence. Salamence, Latios' Draco bombing partner that could also end games with Dragon Dance, was already being looked at for a possible ban even before Latias got the boot, and Salamence did not receive the post-generational invitation to rejoin the tier the way Latias did. In fact, part of the campaign to unban Latias claimed that its brokenness came from being paired up with Salamence, suggesting it would be fine without Salamence also busting tier up, which wound up being true and really speaks to how insane Salamence was, that it wasn't only the most busted thing around, but also made something else broken. That said, the player base did not take kindly to their second pseudo-legendary dragon being taken away from them. The response to its ban wasn't quite as uproarious as Garchomp's, but Salamence getting canned at the end of the generation received vocal opposition by many fond of their longtime familiar metagame destroyer. It had been around so long and had exploitable vulnerabilities in the passive damage trio of Stealth Rock, Life Orb, and Sandstorm that it didn't seem excessive at the time anyway. Now we move on to a ban that is unique and having never lost its controversial edge. We have Drizzle Swift Swim, the unprecedented ban that ensured Black and White would be the weather generation forever. Rain teams were crushing everything in sight through peerless power and speed from day one, and the novelty of having a Drizzle Pokemon in OU quickly wore off as, understandably, players quickly became irritated by how brutally difficult it was to take on so many incredibly powerful rain abusers. A ban was the most obvious thing in the world. Now, while Smogon gets accused of favoritism quite a bit, the claims are usually pretty far off the mark, but here they were spot on. Well, almost. They did literally rearrange the rules here, declaring an exception, but this wasn't a competitively minded decision. Whether this was for optics, to try and avoid upsetting casual players too much, or because those in charge wanted to continue to use rain themselves, we may never know. But either way, they banned the combination of Drizzle and Swift Swim so as to avoid banning the problematic element of Drizzle itself, which even in its nerf form proceeded to dominate and define to overwhelming extents the rest of the generation. There was constant talk from the player base about rain being broken even without being able to destroy everything with Kingdra and Kabutops, but ultimately no action was taken, and that's why Generation 5 will forever be the weather generation. Now from rain we go to fire with Blaziken. Not long after the Drizzle Swim debacle, another controversial vote came along, though in a more traditional ban style, simply a Blaziken ban. Now in retrospect, nobody misses Blaziken because it was pretty unequivocally broken, but its ban was downright scandalous because it was the first starter to ever get the ban hammer. Hordes of fans came out of the woodworks screaming about how Blaziken was weak to Aqua Jet. Putting aside the fact that that was kind of like saying Rayquaza was weak to Ice Shard, there were also demands to ban Speed Boost on Blaziken specifically, preserving it with its original Blaze ability and preventing it from being sent to Ubers, where incidentally, it was pretty ferocious alongside Groudon's permanent sun. After all, if we just banned Drizzle and Swift Swim as to preserve Drizzle, well, that was the exception you see, so that couldn't be done. Of course, nobody would actually use Blaziken in standard play, or probably even UU at this point, so it wasn't much of a loss. That said, Blaziken did pave way for the other starters to get banned later on, like Oraz Greninja and Gen 8 Cinderace getting banned didn't kick up nearly as much of a fuss. Blaziken itself getting banned in Gen 6 and 7 was no longer controversial either. Now onto a more multi-pronged controversy, we have Excadrill. Another one of Black and White's unhinged controversies is Excadrill, whose insane power alongside Sand Rush, allowing it to outrun everything in the game when supported by none other than Tyranitar, made it one of the most broken Pokemon in the game from day one of Gen 5. But it took a long time before Excadrill got the ban hammer, and not for a lack of effort. It was put up for voting 4 times before it was finally banned. For many, it was difficult to consider broken, which was attributed by some to the fact that Excadrill was just a regular Pokemon. It wasn't a legendary, a pseudo-legendary, heck even Blaziken had the special status of being a starter. Excadrill would eventually return though in the post-Black and White 2 metagame, furious with both the lack of truly reliable Rapid Spitters and broken Sun teams. A few top players basically strong-armed a couple of changes into existence. Following Drizzle Swim's logic, Chlorophyll was banned on Sun teams and Excadrill was unbanned, but it couldn't use Sand Rush on Sand teams. Rain teams began using Sand Rush Excadrill as a counter to Sand teams. Either they won the Weather War and maintained Rain, which was generally a win as the whole reason you ran Sand was to prevent Rain teams from using the weather that made them so busted, or they lost the Weather War and swept you with a Pokemon that was so powerful under its specific conditions that the Sand team wasn't allowed to summon them itself. Thus, Sand Rush itself was banned, and this was met with no shortage of pushback. Why not just ban Excadrill itself again? Why do anything to touch Excadrill at all? Why must Stoutland suffer for Excadrill's crimes? Now, the Sand Rush mole's brokenness aside, while it was wreaking havoc on Rain teams, the Arena Trap mole, or moles, were wreaking havoc on Sun teams, and that was just in Gen 5. What is now one of the most well-dubbed bans ever required a lot of arguing to get there. Many asked, how could something as undeniably pathetic as Dugtrio be anything more than a mild nuisance, let alone broken? Well, it started in Gen 7 after it got its attack buff to base 100, and was so adept at picking Pokemon off, it single-handedly launched Stall into the metagame's Apex Predator playstyle, despite facing off against the power creep of both Megas and Z moves. But even at base 80 attack in the preceding gens, Dugtrio was consistently a huge issue, and of course, didn't stop the jeering dismissals. The trapping was so pernicious, Diglett was causing issues. Yes, Diglett. In Gen 5, some insisted that Dugtrio be banned, not Arena Trap itself, as had been the case in other gens, so players got to work on proving that Diglett, while obviously worse, could and would still do the job, so the ability had to be banned there too. This wasn't dissimilar to how in Gens 3 and 4, the Shadow Tag packing Wynaut was banned to Ubers alongside Wobbuffet. Being able to trap everything is utterly insane, and while this wasn't challenged when it was just Wobbuffet and Wynaut, it sure was when Gothitelle came around. It took a while for Gothitelle to find a way to reliably use the ability, but once it did, it caused massive problems, most famously enabling stall teams in Gen 6 with a Trick Scarf set, ruining stall breakers. Yet despite the average player's hatred of stall, there were still many who protested the idea of a blanket Shadow Tag ban. Repeated instances of Gothitelle's malignant travails across the gens resulted in the ability finally becoming recognized as universally broken, also something we take for granted now, but it had to endure a lot of protests to get there. Now for another set of mega broken elements that had to scrap similarly to be recognized as such, we have Baton Pass. We won't harp on Baton Pass, as we've mentioned it in great detail in the past, but it was notable for making Smeargle one of the most terrifying Pokemon that you could encounter across multiple generations. And speaking of hated strategies, next up we've got Evasion Abilities. Sandvale's brokenness was obvious on the already elite Garchomp and made sense on Gliscor as well, though it didn't stop protests. Among them, an insistence that Zoom Lens Slowbro was a reasonable answer. However, such vehement protests really came out in full force in Gen 3, when Cacturne and Gligar were the ones wreaking nigh unstoppable havoc with Sandvale. Such protests were more valid for Snowcloak though, as that didn't have a track record of ruining games, given how bad the abusers were and how difficult it was to make a team pairing them with Abomasnow. Gen 4 losing Froslass needlessly spawned a great deal of ire that you could hardly call unwarranted. That said, similar reactions have been made about various bannings of luck items over the generations. For example, Quick Claw in Gen 4, despite their only function being to cheese, so the people yearn for variance it seems. Now onto a Pokemon again, and what a beast it was, Genesect. How could anyone ever be against this excessively perfect offensive monster's ban, you might wonder? It remains one of the great mysteries of the universe. It dominated early Black and White 2 with numerous sets, all horribly uncounterable in their own way, with the singular exception of Heatran, which, problems of being the one counter aside, also had its own Dugtrio-shaped issues. While Genesect was also a dab hand at fitting on literally every team style, yet despite this absence of counters, despite it consistently destroying everything in battle, many, even though they themselves were victims of it, would protest its ban, citing ridiculous non-counters that nobody used for good reason, like Rotom Heat, as reasonable answers just waiting to be discovered. Fascinating psychological phenomena aside, it's why Genesect took many months before getting the ban hammer despite its brokenness, being out in the open from the first day of Black and White 2. On the bright side, its ban in Gen 6, 7, and 8 were markedly less controversial, albeit leaving some bafflement as to the need for the same song and dance again. Genesect was also commonly paired with another monster, Landorus Incarnate. While Black and White Landorus Incarnate was a monstrous sand-field physical attacker thanks to its Sand Force ability, in Black and White 2 it gained Sheer Force and put up even greater jaw-dropping numbers with special attacks, obtaining as a result of the ability recoil-free Life Orb on the Earth Powers and Focus Blast that shattered nearly the entire metagame. It took a very long time for Landorus' utter demolition of almost everything that wasn't a no-switch hyper-offense team to be considered a sufficient problem to the general player base, but eventually it was suspected, and there were waves of protests from players who liked those kinds of no-switch offensive teams and expressed concern that defensive teams would be too powerful without Lando around, which didn't happen. It was a similar story in Gen 6. Landorus struck around through X and Y since there were bigger fish to fry, but once Oraz rolled around, it eventually got its turn again for how it utterly obliterated balance teams, now even scarier than before, enjoying a buffed knockoff to ruin the Latias and Eviolite Chansey, while its newly useful, ludicrously powerful Sludge Wave smashed the newly Fairy-type Clefable to smithereens. Players once again feared banning Lando would result in balance teams taking over the metagame to unstoppable extents, but it managed to get banned and demonstrate such fears were unfounded again. Next, we've got a multi-generational double whammy with Deoxys Speed and Deoxys Defense. Is being the best at simply getting hazards enough to make a Pokemon broken? Maybe not in the brave new world of heavy-duty boots, leading to Scarlet and Violet's Deoxys Speed sitting comfortably in OU, but previously, it had been peerlessly dominant at throwing instant rocks and spikes down in Ubers, and it had all its attempts at assimilating into standard play result in a ban, though not without some pushback. In Generation 4, a big part of its brokenness actually stemmed from its all-out attacker set, which outran all but the fastest Choice Scarfers. Even something as speedy as Scarf Garchomp wasn't sufficient for it, and so it absolutely bowled over offensive teams. However, the brutally efficient instant rocks and spikes in the lead slot were too much as well, and this only compounded with the power creep in Gen 5 and 6, even in the face of the latter's buff to Fog. The same debate circled around the power of instant layers generation after generation, before leading to the bans that in retrospect seemed like the most obvious necessities, finally resulting in Gen 7, which finally decided to not bother with Deoxys Speed at all, or Deoxys Defense for that matter. In Gen 5, Deoxys Defense had actually dipped as low as UU, while its Speed form was busy ruling OU, but after Speed was banned, turned out that the defense form was similarly excellent and instantly throwing down hazards. Better actually in many cases, thanks to to the increased opportunities afforded by its superb natural bulk, so much so that it was sometimes used instead of speed when both were allowed in XY, leading to their simultaneous ban. Speaking of XY, there was another monster running around there, Aegislash. The perfection of Steel Ghost typing, the stance change ability alongside purposely low speed, which allowed its extraordinary defensive stats to weather hits magnificently, before unleashing terrifying high offensive stats alongside superb Ghost Stab with King's Shield ensuring safe return into the original defensive form without being vulnerable after attacking. Aegislash functionally had a base stat total of 720, which left the 680s like Mewtwo in the dust, alongside a low-risk, high-reward playstyle that tended to render counterplay outright laughable. When presented with the problem of this insanely strong Pokemon also forcing 50-50's weight in its own favor just to not continue getting destroyed by it, many players simply said one had to outplay the coin flip, whose absurdity is staggeringly self-evident even by the maniacal standards of tiering discourse. This sentiment was so widespread, experienced players had to go on a massive misinformation debunking campaign, without which Aegislash's eventual, strangely delayed suspect test and ban likely wouldn't have gone through. But there was another ghost that sparked ire in Gen 6 actually, Mega Sableye. Sableye doesn't seem like the kind of Mega to get banned. It doesn't pose much of an offensive threat, and its defensive capabilities seem limited as well, with less than ideal typing alongside the classic problem of great defenses undercut by low HP and speed. At least it has recover, but to what end? Magic Bounce, that's what. Mega Sableye didn't shut down all entry hazard setters, but it shut down many of them, including a certain staple named Ferrothorn, and with the right defensive partners, made simply getting up early hazards an incredible ordeal, which was a problem because it made certain stall teams downright unbreakable. It wasn't just hazards that blocked, if not successfully bounced back at the user either, but all manner of indirect stall breaking tactics, taunt being the biggest among them, as well as various status and even Leech Seed. Still, despite though stall was, invalidating indirect damage isn't exactly reaching for universal agreement, and many argued against its ban right until Mega Sableye was banned on the very last day of ORAS before Sun and Moon were released. Now, we've talked about Ubers quite a bit in this video, so for the finale, we're looking at the ultimate controversy, the Pokemon who are banned from Ubers. As utterly ludicrous as Mega Rayquaza is, a Mega that is already obscenely strong without getting to also hold an item, there was still some controversy around banning it. After all, this was Ubers. Nothing was supposed to be banned from Ubers, no matter how strong it was. But then again, for all the crazy power flying around it, the Ubers metagame of the past had always found some sort of balance. Even XY, which has seen quite a few cries to ban Xerneas, or as though it was whipped into a maelstrom from which no order could be extracted so long as Mega Rayquaza was around. It quite literally turned the metagame into try not to get crushed by the opposing Mega Rayquaza and get the most out of your own Mega Rayquaza. Nobody could deny its brokenness, and yet it was Ubers. So while Ubers players since the second week of ORAS have been thankful for the creation of the Anything Goes metagame, it was far from a universally loved concept. It was a similar story for Gen 8 Zacian Crown, which, talk about a perfect Pokemon, even more so than Mega Ray. Speed so insane that it didn't even need to use a speed boosting nature to outrun everything it needed, which allowed it to maximize its ludicrous attack, which was boosted every time it switched in by its Intrepid Sword ability, and it also had incredible bulk alongside possibly the most robust defensive typing in the game, Fairy Steel. It took hits from, outran, and destroyed everything. Only the mighty Quagsire could contain it, the truest sign that you were dealing with something busted, but Zacian Crown stuck around Ubers for a long time. It wasn't until well into the Crown Tundra metagame that the player base realized that enough was enough, that they had it with this Monday to Friday Zacian in this Monday to Friday metagame. The prospect of sending it the way of Mega Ray was understandably met with some pushback. Though Anything Goes wasn't an invitation to just ban anything from Ubers, there was a high threshold that had to be met, even for something as perfect as Zacian Crown. After Zacian Crown was banned, it wasn't long before Zacian itself was the next target. Really, some wondered, this mono fairy type with much less attack? Well, yes, because it got to hold an item, and with a choice band attached, even the mighty Quagsire couldn't handle its play rust. There were still protests, of course, but this logic is pretty airtight, so at least they were really arguing with the win. Additionally, Caloric's Shadow was banned to Anything Goes in Gen 9, but there was nearly no controversy over this, given how utterly obscene it was with terrestrialization, which is quite a feat. And thank you so much to our Platinum patrons. Thank you to Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Daniel Isbeast, Corman, Don Creek, Eric Dissing, Espion Lover, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Jack G, King Yabber, Nightfall, Megamon VGC, Mojo Game Slayer, Nurse Jake, One Penguin to Rule, Pretzel SP, Palamute, Schmooter, Seagulls Incorporated, Sojiro Sakura, Spavoon, Skylaria, Soros and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Tyler, Kiboflu, Wardine, Zathor for their major support of our videos.